The frigid night air sliced through her flimsy coat with a sharp intensity. Abigail Carter drew her two sons near, enveloping them in her embrace as they nestled together on the weathered wooden bench of the train station. She was utterly devoid of everything. Insufficient funds. Without a place to call home. Without a husband. Two frightened little boys gazed up at her, their eyes pleading for answers she was unable to provide. Hours had passed since his departure. The man who brought her children into the world. The man who vowed to cherish her for all eternity. The man who had brought her to this place pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, assuring her he would return shortly, and never came back. She had bided her time, and bided my time, until the truth nestled within her very being, cold and unyielding. He was not returning. Her fingers quivered as she wrapped her coat more snugly around her children. She felt the tears welling up inside her, felt an overwhelming urge to let out a primal shout. Yet she was unable to. At this moment, her sons required her strength, even if she sensed that she was coming undone. The train station stood in a quiet stillness, almost deserted. A handful of late-night wanderers hurried by, some draped in luxurious coats, while others seemed too absorbed in their own thoughts to notice the woman on the bench, holding her children tightly as if they were her sole connection to the world around her. Subsequently, a vehicle came to a stop outside. Polished, ebony high-end vehicle. A figure emerged from the shadows. Lofty, authoritative, clad in a meticulously fitted suit. His dark hair was gently ruffled by the breeze. His mere presence altered the atmosphere, drawing curious and respectful glances from those around him. Nathaniel Sterling, a name spoken of in business circles with deep respect. A figure both revered and dreaded in equal parts. He was accustomed to dominance, to empower, to victory. Yet this evening, his presence wasn't for work purposes. This evening, he sought refuge from the clamor of his surroundings. As he entered the station, he drew his coat closer around him, gliding past the deserted ticket booths. And then, he caught sight of her. A lady, perched on a bench. I hold close two slumbering boys, my arms encircling them protectively. Her hair clung to her skin, dampened by the gentle mist of the rain falling outside. Her cheeks were rosy from the chill in the air. Yet it was not her looks that caused him to pause. It was the depth of her gaze. Ghostly, broken, overwhelmed by a familiar ache that he knew all too well. Nathaniel had devoted countless years to mastering the craft of indifference. He had devoted his entire existence to safeguarding his heart behind impenetrable barriers. Yet there was an undeniable quality about her. There was a certain intensity in the way she held those children, as if they were the sole treasures in her universe. Caused a sensation of constriction within him. He paused, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. He ought to step away. He ought to disregard the instinct that was drawing him to her. However, she trembled. Before he could rein in his impulses, he found himself drawn toward her. Abigail hardly noticed the man before her until his rich, resonant voice sliced through the haze of her mind. "Are you okay?" She raised her gaze. For the first time that night, she found herself not gazing at yet another unfamiliar face drifting past her. She gazed intently at him, a man who seemed out of place in this environment. A man clad in a costly suit, his expression inscrutable, should have raised her suspicions. However, instead, she experienced something altogether different, an indescribable feeling. She took a deep breath. "I'm doing well." It was a fabrication. Nathaniel recognized a falsehood the moment it crossed his ears. His piercing blue eyes darted to the children nestled against her. Her posture spoke of exhaustion. The subtle tremor of her fingers, a delicate quiver that spoke volumes. "What's the duration of your stay here?" She paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Period of time. Excessively lengthy." Nathaniel breathed out slowly, surveying the almost deserted station. "Is someone expected to arrive soon?" Her stomach knotted tightly. She felt an overwhelming urge to agree, yearned to hold onto the belief that this was merely a miscommunication. At any moment, The man who had abandoned her in this place would stride through those doors and reclaim everything. Yet she was aware of the reality. Nathaniel did as well. "No," she whispered. A spark danced in his eyes. Comprehension. A subtle acknowledgement. He understood the ache of being left behind. To be abandoned. Once, long ago, he had experienced it. And even now, amidst the bustling train station, he found himself beside a woman he had never encountered before. The familiar pain from that old injury throbbed once more. Nathaniel was not the sort of man to engage in matters beyond his own affairs. He had dedicated years to crafting a life that was meticulously organized, firmly managed, and impervious to disruption. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, for her, he found himself unable to turn away. Instead, he removed his coat. Silently, without uttering a single word, he gently placed it over her shoulders. Abigail tensed. Just take it," he whispered. His voice had taken on a gentler quality. Soft. A striking divergence from the persona the world recognized him as. For an extended period, she simply gazed at him. With a touch of reluctance, she wrapped the coat more closely around herself, feeling the comforting warmth begin to thaw her chilled skin. Nathaniel observed her shaky exhale, her eyes glinting with an emotion that teetered on the edge of gratitude. It would be best for him to go. He ought to just turn away and act as if she were never there. Yet an inner voice whispered to him. That was no longer an option. What about this moment? Is it this evening? It had transformed everything completely, and neither of them was aware of it yet. The coat draped heavily on Abigail's shoulders, not solely in warmth, however, in significance. She had never experienced kindness before, not from unfamiliar faces, not from any source. Yet here she found herself, perched on a frigid train station bench, enveloped in the aroma of luxurious cologne and soft cashmere, as a stranger loomed before her, seemingly attempting to decipher her essence. It seemed he sought to grasp the reason for her presence, why she was abandoned, yet she chose to keep it to herself. This was not his concern, since she was not his concern, even if, beneath the surface, a naive part of her longed for that reality. Nathaniel ought to have turned back. Perhaps I should have just walked away, leaving her to navigate the fragments of her life on her own. Yet he was unable to. There was an undeniable quality in the way she embraced those boys. There was an undeniable quality in her gaze, a profound sense of being adrift, rendered it utterly unfeasible to depart. He took a seat, directly beside her. Abigail tensed. What are you up to? He reclined against the bench, releasing a deep breath. Your options are limited. Her stomach churned. She gulped. That doesn't involve you. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Perhaps not. A stillness lingered in the air between them. Subsequently, do you have relatives? He inquired softly. She paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. She then shook her head. Companions? Yet another shake. Nathaniel let out a quick breath. He was already aware of the answer before he posed the question. A woman with other destinations wouldn't linger here, hours after being left behind. She would still be holding her children tightly, as if fearing they might be snatched away from her at any moment. He ought to step away, yet he refused. Rather, I own a guest house, he stated suddenly. Abigail's eyes darted to him, filled with disbelief. Excuse me? You require accommodation, he stated plainly. I possess one. She gazed at him intently. Incredulity. Doubt lingers. A glimmer of an unspoken feeling lingered in the air. I don't even know you, she whispered. Nathaniel pivoted to meet her gaze completely. I'm providing you with shelter, he whispered. A secure haven for you and your children. That concludes everything. Abigail felt a constriction in her throat, for the simple reason that she wished to affirmatively respond. She had to agree, yet to accept assistance from someone of his caliber. A man who gazed at her as if he were deciphering a complex enigma. A man who walked with the confidence of someone who owned the universe. Filled her with dread. She gently shook her head. I prefer to earn what I have. Nathaniel wore a subtle smirk. Excellent. Since I don't provide them. Her brows knitted together. He leaned in, his voice unwavering. I would like you to collaborate with me. Abigail's eyes fluttered open. Task? He mentioned that my house staff could benefit from an extra set of hands. Tidying up. Arranging. Anything you're prepared to undertake. Her heartbeat throbbed. He was presenting her with more than just an opportunity. He was offering her an escape. A method for enduring. A fresh beginning awaits. She paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. Subsequently, what's the twist? Nathaniel's demeanor remained unchanged. No tricks. Her stomach nodded. There's invariably a hidden twist. He let out a breath. Subsequently, only one. Abigail steeled herself. He turned his gaze toward her, truly observed her, and in a voice more gentle than she had anticipated, he spoke. I'm here to assist you. Her breath caught in her throat, since no one had ever expressed that to her previously. This isn't the way. Without intention. Her jaw tightened as she averted her gaze. She had devoted her entire existence to navigating life independently. She found herself questioning whether she possessed the ability to pursue anything beyond this. Yet, as she cast her gaze upon her sons, at their small faces, serene in slumber, unaware that their universe had just crumbled, she understood that a decision was imperative. Perhaps for the very first time, she wasn't required to face it by herself. Very well, she murmured. Nathaniel's lips sealed tightly. Is everything all right? She locked eyes with him, her voice more resolute this time. I accept the position. A prolonged silence lingered in the air between them. Then Nathaniel gave a slight nod. And just like that, all was transformed. Abigail Carter could hardly believe she was about to enter a house like this. She had lived her life in cramped spaces, dilapidated inns, and locations where the walls were paper-thin and the ceilings dripped whenever it poured. However, this realm was completely different. The estate of Nathaniel Sterling was vast. A grand estate featuring soaring glass windows, gleaming marble floors, and corridors that appeared to extend endlessly. It was more than mere riches. It was strength. It was a realm crafted by an individual who was unfamiliar with the concept of rejection. A man who devoted his existence to shaping the world according to his desires. What comes next? For reasons she still couldn't quite grasp, he had shaped it for her. Mommy, is this our new home? Abigail looked down at her son, Ethan, who held her hand tightly, his large brown eyes brimming with a mix of curiosity and caution. Her throat constricted. For the time being, she murmured gently. She was uncertain about the duration of this situation. Uncertainty loomed as Nathaniel reached the point where he felt he had given all he could. I was uncertain about the authenticity of this. Yet at this moment, her sons were nestled in a cozy bed, and that sufficed. Nathaniel observed her from the other side of the foyer. She felt a sense of uncertainty. Proceed with caution, as if she were anticipating the instant he would retract everything. He grasped that concept, yet he also despised it. He wasn't motivated by pity. His actions were not driven by pity for her. He found himself compelled to act, as if Abigail Carter had a way of unraveling him from the inside out. For in that moment at the train station, as he observed her holding her children, she appeared so utterly adrift. He had sensed something, a burden he had labored for years to conceal. Despite his best efforts to dismiss it, the sensation lingered, refusing to fade. Abigail navigated the initial days at the estate with a focus on endurance and resilience. She toiled diligently, rising before the sun to assist the household staff, scrubbing floors, dusting furniture, and keeping herself occupied. Being busy allowed her to avoid thoughts of him, concerning the manner in which Nathaniel observed her when he believed she was unaware, concerning how his aura enveloped each space he entered, concerning how her body seemed to turn against her whenever he was close. She found it impossible to dwell on that, because men like Nathaniel Sterling were not the type to be captivated by women like her. And even if they happened to do so, they always left. She discovered him in the library one evening, positioned by the window, a drink cradled in his hand, the city lights shimmering in the distance. Her intention was merely to deliver the papers that his assistant had forgotten. Yet there was an undeniable quality in his stance. Quiet, immovable, as if he existed in a different realm altogether, caused her to hesitate. For a fleeting moment, she lost sight of the fact that he held the position of her employer. He was a man to be feared. She advanced with deliberate caution. "You tend to keep your thoughts to yourself," she whispered. Nathaniel's lips quivered slightly. "Nor do you." She paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. "What thoughts are crossing your mind?" He released a breath, letting the amber liquid dance within his glass. "Aspects beyond my control." Her chest throbbed under the heavy silence of his words. She understood that sensation all too well. To bear burdens of remorse too weighty to release. To rise each morning with the awareness that certain things cannot be mended. She moved in a bit closer, her voice now a gentle whisper. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel pivoted then, as his piercing blue gaze locked onto hers. Her breath caught in her throat. As this marks a first, she perceived a certain fragility within them. Something is amiss, and before she could hold back, she was determined to make it right. She aimed to mend him, and that was riskier than anything else. Abigail had dedicated years to mastering the art of survival. She had mastered the art of staying focused, of putting in the effort, of setting aside her own struggles and continuing to forge ahead. Yet, she had never figured out how to respond when someone like Nathaniel Sterling gazed at her in such a manner. As if he had caught sight of her. As if he desired her. As if she were something greater than merely a woman abandoned at a train station. And that filled her with dread. Because individuals like him had no place in her realm. And yet, there remains a lingering uncertainty. She found herself unable to turn and leave. Nathaniel placed his glass on the table, each motion measured and intentional. He had devoted his entire existence to maintaining control. He constructed his empire with meticulous care, molding his reality into a realm of certainty. Yet Abigail Carter defied expectations. Despite all his efforts to persuade himself that she was merely another lost soul he had welcomed into his life, he was aware of the reality. He desired her, exceeding what is necessary, exceeding what was prudent, and considering how she remained steadfast. Her breath caught in her throat as he approached her. She sensed it as well. "What motivates you to assist me?" Abigail murmured, compelling herself to shatter the stillness. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I'm uncertain." She gulped. "That doesn't provide a solution." His cerulean gaze deepened. "No," he whispered. "It certainly isn't." A prolonged quiet lingered in the air between them. Subsequently, Nathaniel made contact, gradually, allowing her the space to distance herself. Yet she chose not to. His fingers lightly grazed her wrist, and in an instant, it felt as though the very air had been drawn out of the room. Abigail's heart raced. It would be best for her to go. She ought to. As Nathaniel tilted his head, his eyes danced toward her lips, her whole being turned against her. She longed for his kiss. She required his assistance. And when he ultimately did, it lacked tenderness. It lacked caution. It was absolutely captivating. It was a torrent of unvoiced thoughts and suppressed emotions, overwhelming her in a single moment. His hands clasped her waist, drawing her close, his breath ragged, his composure fracturing. Abigail inhaled sharply, clutching his shirt tightly, sensing the heat radiating from him. There was an undeniable urgency in his touch. And may divine intervention be with her. She was reluctant to cease. However, a delicate whisper broke the stillness. "Mother?" Abigail stood still, caught in the moment. Nathaniel tensed up. She pivoted quickly, her heart racing, to find Ethan in the doorway, rubbing his weary eyes, his small brow creased in bewilderment. Guilt crashed into her with the force of a freight train. What was she up to? She recoiled from Nathaniel, retreating 2 swift steps to create space between them. She cleared her throat, mustering a smile as she bent down. "Hey, darling," she whispered, her voice trembling. What seems to be the issue? Ethan blinked with drowsy eyes. I experienced a troubling dream. Abigail took a deep breath. Approach me. Ethan approached her softly, effortlessly settling into her embrace, his small fingers clutching her shirt tightly. She held him close, shutting her eyes momentarily to find her center. Then, with a touch of reluctance, she cast a glance back at Nathaniel. His expression was a complete enigma. Yet there was a certain depth in his gaze, something unrefined. I expressed to her that this moment had transformed everything. Despite her deepest desires to act as if that kiss had never occurred, both were aware of the reality, and there was no way to go back now. Abigail spent the remainder of the night cradling Ethan, murmuring gentle reassurances as he slipped back into slumber. Yet she remained awake. She was unable to. Not while her heart continued to race. Not when the sensation of his kiss still lingered on her lips. Not when every time she shut her eyes, all that filled her mind was Nathaniel Sterling. The manner in which he had gazed at her. The way his hands clutched her waist as if he were desperate to anchor himself to something tangible. As if he couldn't survive without her. She had never quite experienced the sensation of being essential. This was unfamiliar to her, and that filled her with a deeper fear than anything else could. The dawn arrived all too quickly. The sunlight poured through the expansive windows of the guest house, bathing the room in a warm, golden hue. Ethan and Oliver remained in slumber, their tiny forms nestled under the heavy blankets that Nathaniel had thoughtfully given them. After weeks of restless nights, they finally found themselves nestled in the comfort of a real bed. The idea caused a pang in her heart. She tenderly ran her fingers through Ethan's tousled curls, placing a gentle kiss on his forehead before rising to her feet. She craved a breath of fresh air. She required some distance. Yet above all, she had to determine what on earth her next steps would be. The estate exuded a tranquil stillness that morning, a silence born from opulence and the comfort of habit. Servants glided through the corridors, preparing breakfast, buffing furniture that shone with perfection, safeguarding the pristine world Nathaniel had crafted. And yet, despite its flawless design, the house exuded a sense of emptiness, as if an essential piece were absent, as if he had vanished. Abigail took a deep breath, concentrating intently as she made her way down the corridor toward the dining hall. She was focused, intent on her purpose. She was present for her work, to create, to endure, to ensure her sons had shelter and sustenance. That was everything that counted. What is the reason behind that? As she entered the dining room, her gaze fell upon Nathaniel, poised at the head of the elongated mahogany table, clad in yet another flawlessly tailored suit, engrossed in a business report. Did her heart cease to beat? Nathaniel hesitated to lift his gaze immediately, failed to recognize her existence. Not a single reaction. Yet, she was aware that he had seen her. He realized it as his jaw had tightened just a bit, as his fingers rested motionless on the page he was immersed in. The atmosphere around them changed. "Good morning," she murmured softly. With deliberate care, he shut the folder that lay before him. Then, his piercing blue gaze rose to connect with hers. In an instant, she found herself gasping for air. Abigail. Her stomach knotted at the way he pronounced her name. It had a distinct resonance when it came from him. She took a deep breath, reflecting on the events of last night. Refrain. His voice carried a soft whisper, steadfast, a cautionary note. Her heart was heavy with sorrow, for she understood the implications of that knowledge. He felt a deep sense of remorse. Yet, she couldn't quite grasp why that pain felt so profound. Nathaniel had spent the whole night convincing himself that the kiss held no significance. It was a moment of poor decision-making, an error. But when he caught sight of her there in the morning light, her brown hair a bit tousled, her lips slightly parted as if she was on the verge of saying something he wasn't prepared to hear, he experienced it once more. The desire, the necessity, the pain, filled him with rage. This was never meant to occur. She was never meant to be. Thus, he took the sole action available to him. He closed it off. It was an error, he stated, his tone icy. Abigail tensed. Her complexion drained of color, her hands balled into tight fists at her sides. An error. The words pierced her deeply. She raised her chin, compelling herself to acknowledge with a nod. Certainly, she whispered. She pivoted gracefully and strode away. And Nathaniel. Nathaniel despised the painful throb in his chest as he observed her departure. For he was aware that he had just shattered the bond they shared. He found himself uncertain if he could ever mend it. Time flowed by, and all was transformed. Abigail steered clear of him. She glided through the house like a specter, maintaining her distance, unwilling to confront the lingering tension that still buzzed between them. Nathaniel reassured himself that this was beneficial. This was the necessary course of action. She had to realize that whatever had nearly transpired between them was not meant to exist in his reality. However, he spotted her in the garden alongside Ethan and Oliver. I observed her laughter as she darted through the grass, the sunlight illuminating her skin, and the way she seemed perfectly at home in this moment. For the first time in ages, Nathaniel Sterling found himself yearning for something just out of reach. He desired her, and he was utterly at a loss regarding how to handle the situation. That evening, everything reached a tipping point. As Abigail assisted the house staff in arranging the dining table, she sensed his presence looming behind her. She tensed, setting the final plate down before pivoting. Nathaniel stood uncomfortably near. It's quite warm, excessively perilous. Her throat constricted. What is it that you desire? He hesitated before responding. Instead, he observed her intently. His gaze wandered across her features, seeking something elusive that she couldn't quite grasp. Subsequently, in a hushed manner, "You occupy my thoughts endlessly." Her breath caught in her throat. She despised how her pulse responded. She despised how his voice sent chills racing along her spine. Disliked how she clung to the hope that this was genuine. She let out a strained chuckle. It was unmistakably conveyed that the occurrence was an error. His jaw twitched. I was not truthful. The atmosphere became icy. Abigail's heart raced with intensity. Nathaniel moved in, his fingertips brushing against her wrist, setting every nerve in her body alight. I attempted to keep my distance, he whispered, his tone gravelly. I attempted to erase the memory of your presence in my home, in my personal space. I attempted to feign that this wasn't the case, he breathed out sharply. Indeed it is. Her throat constricted. Nathaniel, he confessed, I have no regrets about kissing you. She fixed her gaze on him. She felt uncertain about whether she was inhaling or exhaling. Subsequently, gently with a hint of urgency, I wish I hadn't allowed you to leave. And just like that, all the barriers she had constructed collapsed around her. She acted without consideration, did not waver. She couldn't hold back as she reached for him, as her fingers grasped the material of his suit, as she drew him closer to her. And this moment, as their lips touched, neither of them withdrew. Neither of them resisted it. Because whatever this might be, whatever was unfolding between them, it had become an undeniable reality for them. It was genuine, and it was merely the start. Abigail had always been skeptical of fairy tales. She always doubted the existence of gallant heroes in gleaming armor, or monumental acts that might wipe away countless years of hardship. Yet, in that moment when Nathaniel Sterling pressed his lips against hers, as his fingers wove through her locks, when his lips brushed against hers, it felt as if he had been yearning for this moment. Dedicated to her, she had faith in him, even if it posed a risk, even if it was audacious, even if it had the power to shatter her entirely. In that instant, embracing her tightly, as his body bore down on her, she found herself pinned against the edge of the dining table. She was indifferent. She desired this. She desired him. After a long stretch of time, she embraced her desire for something that was solely hers. Nathaniel had devoted his existence to making deliberate decisions. He considered his actions carefully. He maintained clarity, refusing to let feelings obscure his decision-making. He always maintained his composure, up until her. Everything changed the moment Abigail Carter entered his world. shattered the fortress he had meticulously constructed, and awakened emotions he had long since buried. What comes next? At this point, there was no turning back. I just couldn't bring myself to halt. Not when she was finally allowing him to enter her world. Not when she was responding to his kiss with equal fervor. The identical sense of urgency. Not when her form melded so seamlessly with his, as if she had always been meant to be there. However, a delicate whisper broke the silence. "Mother?" Abigail stood still, her body rigid. Nathaniel tensed up. They pivoted quickly to find Ethan framed in the doorway, rubbing his drowsy eyes, gazing at them in bewilderment. Abigail felt a sinking sensation in her stomach. She recoiled from Nathaniel with such urgency that she almost lost her balance. Her cheeks flushed with heat, embarrassment coiling within her as she hurriedly moved across the room, hunched down before her child. "Hey, darling," she murmured. He swept his unruly curls away from his face. "Did you experience another unsettling dream?" Ethan gazed up at her, his eyes wide with curiosity. Then at Nathaniel. Then she turned her gaze back to him. "No," he replied in a measured tone. Yet I perceived whispers. Her heart was heavy with sorrow. She cast a fleeting look back at Nathaniel, who stood there, tense, with an expression that revealed nothing. This was an error. This was entirely an error. She was unable to accomplish this. Not with Ethan and Oliver relying on her. Not after a lifetime of being overlooked. Not when approaching a man like Nathaniel Sterling involved jeopardizing it all. She inhaled unsteadily, mustering a smile for Ethan's benefit. "How about we head back to bed now, all right?" Ethan nodded drowsily, and she cradled him in her arms, exiting the dining hall without a glance behind her, without casting a glance in his direction. For the reason that she may find it difficult to leave. Nathaniel spent the night wide awake. He lingered in his office, gazing at the whiskey in his glass, reliving each moment of what had transpired, the flavor of her kiss, the warmth of her form pressed against his, the manner in which she had dashed the instant her son entered. And he loathed it, disliked that she believed she needed to escape from him. She believed he was just a fleeting presence. A matter of trust eluded her grasp. Yet he comprehended, because no one had ever lingered for her. She had never been chosen by anyone, and if she believed he would resemble the rest, she was mistaken. Nathaniel Sterling pursued the things he desired without hesitation, and he desired her, above all else. The following morning, Abigail put forth her utmost effort to act as if nothing had transpired. She maintained her concentration, diligently attending to her tasks, steering clear of prolonged glances in his direction. Yet she sensed his presence. She could sense the intensity of his stare each time she stepped into the room. The air was charged with an unspoken tension, palpable and heavy between them. And she understood. She understood he would not easily move past this. As she ventured outside for a breath of fresh air, she was met with the sight of him standing by the garden, hands tucked into his pockets, his demeanor strikingly grave. She felt no shock. She took a deep breath, folding her arms tightly. "Nathaniel, refrain." His voice carried a resolute strength, consistent. As he drew nearer, the crisp morning air unexpectedly transformed into a suffocating warmth. "You're in motion," he whispered. She let out a quick breath. "I must." His cerulean gaze deepened. "What is the reason?" She laughed, though there was no joy in it. "It lay in pieces. Because I have 2 boys to consider," she said, her voice trembling. "I cannot allow myself to become entangled in something that lacks authenticity." His jaw tightened. "Do you really believe this isn't genuine?" Her throat constricted. "I believe individuals like you tend to move on." Stillness. Subsequently, Nathaniel extended his hand toward her, softly, with great attention, as if he feared she might break apart. His fingers glided over her wrist, his touch both warm and reassuring. And in a tone more gentle than she had ever experienced from him, he spoke. "I remain present. Am I not?" Abigail's breath caught in her throat. For that reason he was. in spite of all the reasons against it, in spite of all the cautions she had shared with him, in spite of all the barriers she had constructed. He remained present. Perhaps, she wished for him to remain. Epilogue: a love that endured. Half a year later, Abigail Carter had moved beyond mere survival. She was no longer finding herself in train stations or contemplating whether she would have sufficient funds to provide for her boys. She had ceased to run, because she had discovered a place to belong, a true sanctuary. Accompanied by Nathaniel, Ethan and Oliver dashed through the halls, their laughter echoing in the once quiet mansion. With Nathaniel observing them, his gaze held a depth that caused her heart to ache, because he hadn't merely succumbed to her charm, he had succumbed to their allure. As she settled onto the balcony, enveloped in Nathaniel's embrace, gazing at the sunset, she allowed herself to finally believe it, that affection might truly exist. It is true that a few individuals chose to remain, and that she had ultimately discovered a man who would always hold on to her.